Eventually he believed that I was the person that was supposed to kill his wife. And I did, and as she ran, I shot her, and then I shot her a second time. And then I left.
Love is a very powerful force. It makes us do things we never even thought to be capable of doing. However, when love crosses the line towards infatuation, that force can become dangerous. This is what happened in Colorado Springs over 30 years ago. Dianne Hood was walking home when she was shot to death. What seemed like a robbery at first quickly unfolded as a plot against her. The mastermind behind it was her husband Brian, but it wasn't him who pulled the trigger. Brian's lover Jennifer was part of the plan too, and she was the one to execute it. The story of the twisted love triangle gone wrong had similarities to the movie Fatal Attraction, earning Jennifer the nickname of the Fatal Attraction Killer. For years, Jennifer insisted that she was manipulated by Brian, while Brian maintained he had nothing to do with the murder of his wife. While the two lovers threw the blame at each other, there was one person whose story we'd never get to hear. Dianne. Dianne Hood was 32 years old. She was born in 1958 in Texas, but had moved to Colorado. One of her children would later describe her as a kind person who loved to laugh. Dianne's life wasn't easy. She suffered from lupus, an autoimmune disease in which the immune system attacks healthy tissue in the body. Lupus doesn't have a cure, and its symptoms can be extremely painful in the most serious cases. Dianne lived with her condition as best as it would let her, and found comfort within a lupus support group in a community center in Colorado Springs where she lived in 1990. It was this group she was leaving on September 12, 1990, when without warning, someone grabbed her bag from behind her and then shot her as she tried to run away. As Dianne lay on the floor fighting for her life, her attacker fired a second shot at her before fleeing from the scene with her bag. A witness who had been walking with Dianne at the time quickly called emergency services. First responders arrived within minutes and rushed Dianne to the hospital. However, it was too late. Dianne Hood was already dead. The first bullet had gone through her. The second went into her chest, killing her in a matter of minutes. The police got to work immediately, starting to investigate what seemed to be a robbery gone wrong. Dianne's bag was recovered nearby, but her wallet was gone. They also found an army jacket, military-style trousers, a black ski mask, and gloves. The clothes seemed to fit the description the witness had given, describing the attacker as being around 5'6". Dog hair was also found on the clothes, suggesting the attacker was a dog owner. Ballistics analysis on the bullets recovered from Dianne's body concluded they came from an 1870s Colt .45 Peacemaker, an antique gun not commonly found unless it came from someone's vintage weapon collection. However, police didn't quite understand why someone would so violently rob a young woman coming out of a support group in the local community center. People didn't usually bring that much cash on them to these kind of meetings, and Dianne didn't appear to be showing off her wealth by wearing any fancy clothes or jewelry either. Something didn't add up for it to just be a robbery gone wrong. Investigators quickly spoke to Dianne's husband, Brian Hood. Brian worked as an insurance salesman, went to church regularly, was happily married, and had 3 children. The evening of September 12th, Brian had been watching their 3 children while Dianne was at her meeting. He also didn't match the physical description given by the witness, since he was much taller, standing at 6'3". So while still being watched by investigators, nothing pointed towards him having any reason to harm his wife. That is, until the next day. By the next morning, most of the neighbors were aware of what happened to Dianne, but a local florist had information he thought the police ought to know. He had reason to believe one of his employees, a young woman, was having an affair with Brian Hood, Dianne's husband. This woman was Jennifer Reali. 28-year-old Jennifer had 2 children with her husband Ben Reali, an Army intelligence officer at Fort Carson. The couple had met in college and married young. However, after a few years, they found themselves going through a rough patch in their marriage. Ben admitted to this when the police spoke to him, telling them they were separated at the time. He had a solid alibi for the night Dianne was shot, but he gave very interesting information to the police. When shown the clothes found at the scene, he confirmed they looked like items of clothing he owned. But what was most interesting was the fact that Ben told investigators he owned a vintage .45 caliber revolver matching the one investigators believed had been used to shoot Dianne. He usually kept it at an armory, but had recently moved it home after his wife Jennifer had told him she felt unsafe at home ever since they had decided to separate. She asked him to bring the gun home for protection, and a few days later requested he take it back with him. This timeline matched the shooting, so the police shifted gears and began focusing on Jennifer. Warrant in hand, the police searched Jennifer's home. The antique gun was also confiscated and tested against the bullets found in Dianne's body. The match was 90% positive. The Realis also had a dog, whose hair was tested against the hair found on the clothes recovered from the scene. It was also a positive match. Things weren't looking good for Jennifer, but the first time she was questioned, she denied any implication. She insisted Dianne Hood was just a friend, and they had never been involved in anything but friendship. Of course, she also denied having to do anything with Dianne and the shooting that killed her. However, the evidence was telling another story, and so were other witnesses. Some of the employees from the gym Jennifer and Brian trained at told the police they had seen the two together many times, and they acted very much like a couple. Under the pressure of the investigators and all of the pieces of evidence falling into place, Jennifer didn't have much choice. She confessed to the affair, and shortly confessed she had been the one to pull the trigger. Jennifer and Brian had met at the gym a few weeks prior to the events.
The first time I met Brian was in the jacuzzi, and, he uncurled his huge body and shook my hand and said, "Hi, my name is Dianne Hood," and I said, "Hi, I'm Jennifer Reali."
According to Jennifer's story, during those first conversations, Brian told her about Dianne and her struggles with lupus, how it was affecting her, and how he was worried about her. She said he came across as very loving towards Dianne, and he was very open about his faith too. After talking, Brian told Jennifer they could discuss insurance at her house, and since her husband Ben was away, Jennifer agreed to let him come over. The two ended up having sex and initiating an affair. Since Jennifer's marriage wasn't going well, she fell head over heels over Brian and became infatuated by him. After starting their affair, Brian had told Jennifer that since they'd had sex, they were now one in the eyes of God, and how important it was for them to stick together now. Brian would tell Jennifer all about Dianne's illness and how it was affecting him. He would tell her he was miserable and suffering because of it. He even told her he wished his wife would die so they'd all stop suffering, even contemplating ending things himself and killing her. According to Jennifer's side of the story, he said divorce was never an option, since that would mean he'd live in sin for the rest of his life. Brian brought up the possibility of Jennifer being the one to do it. In his eyes, she was an angel sent by God to help him through this, and she could help him set things right. And although she claims to have said she wouldn't do it, she ended up giving in to the plan. God's plan, in fact, according to hers and Brian's words. The plan they came up with was simple. Jennifer would dress in disguise and hide outside the community center, waiting for Dianne to exit her meeting. Then, she'd fake a robbery and shoot her twice, to make sure she died. That would be the end of Dianne's suffering, and Jennifer and Brian would be free to be together at last. And that's exactly how things went down. Now, everything we just heard is Jennifer's side of the story, but these events have never been admitted by Brian. His story is very different. After Jennifer's confession and arrest, Brian was also arrested and charged for murder. However, the story told by him and his lawyers was very different to Jennifer's. Although he admitted the affair, Brian denied having anything to do with the murder plot. His lawyers maintained that Brian had decided to end the affair with Jennifer and go back to his wife, and it had been Jennifer who had sought revenge after a broken heart. The story of a crazy lover obsessed over a married man after a night of passion fascinated the media, who decided to call Jennifer the Fatal Attraction Killer, after the popular 1987 movie starring Glenn Close and Michael Douglas. This nickname placed Jennifer as the bad one, and Brian's lawyers played along with it. However, upon investigation, some of Brian's secrets were revealed. Apparently, Brian had openly discussed killing his wife not only with Jennifer, but with some of his friends too, who at the time had taken it just as a sick joke. He had also taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on her shortly before the murder, which was the main piece of evidence prosecutors built their case upon. As an insurance salesman himself, Brian knew he would never get the money if he was involved in the murder, so he had to find someone to pull the trigger for him, someone vulnerable and easy to manipulate, someone like Jennifer. In order to convict Brian, Jennifer agreed to testify against him, in exchange for a deal that took the death penalty off the table for her. Brian's trial began in 1991, and the prosecutors used Jennifer's testimony as well as the insurance policy to build a case against him, presenting him as a manipulator and the mastermind behind the plot against Dianne. He was convicted of second-degree murder for conspiring to kill his wife, and sentenced to 37 years in prison. Jennifer's testimony against Brian helped her avoid the death penalty, but although the defense presented her as a victim and being manipulated by Brian to do his dirty work, she was still found guilty of first-degree murder in 1992. She was given life in prison with the possibility of parole. Jennifer finally spent 26 years in prison and was released to a halfway house in December of 2017. However, she had pancreatic cancer and passed away only 3 months after being released. During her time in prison, she gave interviews, and although she took responsibility for what she'd done, she insisted it was all Brian's fault for manipulating her. She also showed remorse, and even stated she wished she could trade places with Dianne.
She should be bouncing grandbabies on her lap. She shouldn't be where she is. I'd trade places with her if I could. Because she's the one who needs to be living.
Dianne Hood spent 27 years in prison, but he wasn't a model prisoner. In 1997, he and another inmate briefly escaped the medium security facility they were in, but were caught only a few hours later. He was officially paroled on March 11, 2019, although still had to serve 15 more months in county jail for an unrelated contraband charge. Despite her struggles with her illness, Dianne had her life ahead of her. Her children were her pride and joy, and she thought she had a supportive, loving husband at her side. Without even knowing about it, she was dragged into a situation that cost her her life. Whether Jennifer was manipulated or not, or whether Brian was a victim of a fatal attraction, it doesn't matter, because Dianne paid the consequences of something she didn't even know was happening. Dianne Hood is the only victim in this case.